scripture reading comes from the book of James, chapter 3, verses 1 through 12. My brothers and sisters, not many of you should become teachers, because we know that we teachers will be judged more strictly. We all make mistakes often, but those who don't make mistakes with their words have reached full maturity. Like a bridled horse, they can control themselves entirely. When we bridle horses and put bits in their mouths to lead them wherever we want, we can control their whole bodies. Consider ships. They are so large that strong winds are needed to drive them, but pilots direct their ships wherever they want with a little rudder. In the same way, even though the tongue is a small part of the body, it boasts wildly. Think about this. A small flame can set a whole forest ablaze. The tongue is a small flame of fire, a world of evil at work in us. It contaminates our entire lives. Because of it, the circle of life is set on fire. The tongue itself is set on fire by the flames of hell. People can tame and already have tamed every kind of animal, bird, reptile, fish, but no one can tame the tongue, though it is a restless evil, full of deadly poison. With it we both bless the Lord and Father and curse human beings made in God's likeness. Blessing and cursing come from the same mouth. My brothers and sisters, it just shouldn't be this way. Both fresh water and salt water don't come from the same spring, do they? My brothers and sisters, can a fig tree produce olives? Can a grapevine produce figs? Of course not. And fresh water doesn't flow from a salt water spring either. This is the word of God to the people of God. Thanks be to God. Good morning, church. It's wonderful to see you all again. This is my third week being with you all, and it's a joy to be back. But I was thinking that since it's my third week with you, and considering that I cried in one of those 3 weeks, I figured that we know each other well enough now that I could admit something to you, right? So here's what I want to know. That coming out was a weird experience. And that's the understatement of the century. And I want to tell you a little bit about why it was weird and why it's so odd even thinking back on it. On the one hand, it was deeply physiological, meaning it physically affected when I said words. I will never forget the afternoon I first said the words to myself and to my best friend who I was talking with. And I literally started shaking and trembling as I was walking to the point that I almost tripped. And it was odd in terms of what was going on, as if my body was both trying to resist and accept these new words that I was saying. On the other hand, these words somehow changed all of my relationships. That just by saying words that I had never said before, all of my relationships with my friends, with my family, with myself had to be reconsidered. I said the words out loud that I was gay, and boom, everything was on fire, right? James would love this. That everything had to be renegotiated. Nothing about me had changed, but just because I had said a certain set of words together, my entire world was turned upside down. Are you with me? Our texts today are all about tongues and the power of words. That this small fleshy organ, right? I see a couple of you, we should just all start right now, like this thing that we should all think about. This small fleshy organ that supposedly has the power to end and create worlds. That all of our readings today have to do with the words and speech that our tongues produce and the effects that they can have on ourselves, our neighbors, and our world. Each of our scripture readings today takes seriously the stakes involved of speaking rightly and speaking wrongly. So my sense is, before I sat down to start writing this sermon, that we're all pretty proud of our ability to speak, right? Even the little bit that I was learning about tongues this week, as I was Googling it, Wikipedia and medical websites all loved to point out that even though other mammals have tongues, it is only our tongues that somehow can make the noises and vibrations that become words that become speech. And we're very proud that our tongues have the power to do that. And then we take that pride in our ability to speak and we come to our reading from James today. And we could probably rightly ask James, what's the big deal? Why are we so worked up? Why are we so worked up about our ability to speak? Why do you have such a deep problem with our tongues? What is going on? And so to help us think about maybe why James comes out so strongly against the speech and against the tongues that he sees as being at work in the world around him, I want to pull in our third text for today. As many of you know, every day, every week, if you follow along with the lectionary, there are actually 3 texts, right? We always have a text from the Old Testament, and then we always have a text from the Epistle or the New Testament, but then there's always a gospel text from Matthew, Mark, Luke, or John. And today we get to read it in the liturgy, and so I wanted to read to you what the text was today that got paired with the other 2. And maybe through that text we can begin to make sense of what's happening here. So our gospel text today came out of Mark chapter 8. And it says this: Jesus and his disciples went into the villages near Philippi. On the way, he asked his disciples, "Who do people say that I am?" They told him, "Some say John the Baptist. Others say Elijah. Others say that you are a prophet." He asked them, "And what about you? Who do you say that I am?" Peter answered, "You are the Christ." Then Jesus began to teach his disciples, saying, "The human one must suffer many things and be rejected by the elders, chief priests, and legal experts, and be killed, and then 3 days later rise from the dead." He said this plainly, but Peter took hold of Jesus and, scolding him, began to correct him. Jesus turned and looked at his other disciples and then sternly corrected Peter, saying, "Get behind me, Satan. You are not thinking God's thoughts, but human thoughts." And so what does this have to do with James? I think by reading these passages together, what we see is that both Jesus and James are confronting rogue tongues. That they're confronting the ways that our speech was not only tearing down good worlds, but by tearing them down, they were building up wrong and harmful worlds. So powerful and so destructive was this speech that for James in our passage, and I tried to emphasize this, James seems to think that these rogue tongues actually have the power to unleash a type of hell on earth. That the hurt that a broken tongue creates in the world, James says, quotes, stains, and it singes by the fires of one's heart, one's hurtful speech. Fires that consume the very cycle of life and is itself set on fire by hell, a restless evil full of deadly poison. For Jesus, as he's correcting Peter, they are the very words of Satan because they obscure a clear understanding of the presence of God in the world right in front of us. Are you with me? To try to help us think about what's going on here, I wanted to share with you a little about the 18th century revivalist John Wesley, who a lot of you maybe have heard of. And John Wesley also pointed out this link between one's speech, one's tongue, and the ways that that tongue can literally unleash hell around us. For Wesley, like James and Jesus, hell was not only some place in the future that we go, but it was a present reality that people not only lived into, but could actually usher in. And so this is what he had to say. What is hell, Wesley asked, but a life devoid of love? One of the key dynamics of love for Wesley was that love is kind. And for Wesley, that kindness manifested itself in one's speech. That whosoever, Wesley says, feels the love of God and fellow humans shed abroad in their heart, feels an ardent and uninterrupted thirst after the happiness of their fellow creatures. And out of the abundance of that love in their heart, their mouth will speak. In their tongue is the law of kindness, Wesley says. The flame within is continually working itself away and spreading abroad more and more in every instance of goodwill to all with whom that person meets. So that wherever they are, whether they think or speak or whatever they do, it all points to the same end, the advancing by every possible way the happiness of all of their fellow creatures, by speaking that into existence. For Wesley, those whose tongues are not tongues of love, are not tongues of kindness, are calling into existence hell on earth for themselves. Wesley says this, does any person find themselves filled with ill will, filled with a rotten tongue? If that is the case, there is misery. If they are filled with ill will and a tongue that is not a tongue of love, that person inhabits a world of misery that is itself a type of hell. That already that person is experiencing the torment and the misery that we would call a life completely devoid of love, that we would call a life of hell. Are you with me? This is my last point, and I promise this will have a hopeful turn, so hang on. Because the other point that's really important here is that why we have a right tongue, why we have a tongue of love, and not a tongue that is going to tear down the loving world around us, is because not only does it create in me, the bearer of that tongue, a type of hell, but it can actually create a type of hell for those around me, for those who my tongue is trying to speak to. We glimpse the deep hurt involved here when we think of modern psychology. Psychologists and counselors often point out the profound importance of using loving, encouraging words with babies and with youth, with children and with students. For to speak wrongly into their lives is actually to warp the psychological and emotional development to the point that future relationships are put at risk. In other words, what these child advocates and what these educators are saying is that the more hurtful speech that one speaks into children's lives as they're growing up, you're not only destroying the possibility of being a family in that moment, but by convincing that person that everything around them is wrong, that they are broken, that they have nothing good to give. You're not only destroying family in that moment, but you are so affecting their psychological development that there is a chance that you will create a reality in which they don't even have the attachment necessary for family in the future. Okay, it's important to say here, as we're thinking about this power that our tongues and our speech has in our own life and the lives of others, to say here, especially in a sermon on speaking rightly in the right words, that the problem is not that we have tongues. The problem is not that our words and speech have power. The problem is that this power has been put to destructive instead of constructive ends. A great theologian once wrote this, that great evil in people is called sin because that same capacity could have been used for great good. That great evil in people is called sin because that same greatness could have been used for great good. Even our passage in James kind of speaks to this deep disappointment that is part of this power. James says, does a spring pour forth from the same opening fresh and salt water? Can a tree yield two types of fruit? James says, no, absolutely not. Meaning that for him, the disappointment here is that God has called us to be springs of fresh and reviving water. That God has called us to be trees that bear the fruit of God's love to each other. And that sometimes, instead of doing what we are called and empowered to do, we actually bear bitter fruits of brokenness. That we actually pour forth speech and water that leaves people more dry in the way that we found them. And that there is a disappointment there because our calling and our power that had implored us to use that calling and power to the healing and reviving of others. Our passages from Psalm that Linda read for us and Isaiah provide a glimpse at the ways that the small fire of our tongue can and should be used in nurturing, life-giving, and world-building ways. Our psalm passage that was actually our call to worship that we all read together imagines how nature itself, the stars in the sky, so gush forth with love and wonder that the speech and the words that they use actually go out even to the ends of the world. And such communication from these stars and from nature not only becomes something that transcends what they are, in that it is voiceless and wordless, but that these words actually brings the world closer to God. That the nature's right speech actually restores the relationship between nature, God, and us. That as the heavens speak of God, the psalmist who is writing all of this down is actually led back to God's law. That is led back to God's regulations, commands, to the ways that God is working to set the world right, to a deeper understanding of love and reality. All of that just because nature is saying the right, good things. Perhaps we could say here that instead of hell, these right words and this right speech actually brings forth heaven, where they are proclaimed. We see the way the tongue is able to bridge earth and heaven in our text from Isaiah. God's faithful servant, we are told, is the one who has been given an educated tongue to know how to respond to the weary with a word that will awaken them in the morning. Importantly, as Isaiah goes on, this tongue has been educated and formed from the relationship the speaker has with God. That this speaker has listened to God, taking in God's own words and speech. That this speaker has leaned into the relationship with God instead of pushing against God. And because of this closeness, the educated tongue is able to participate with God's creative speech in responding to the weary and awakening them to the dawn of a new creation. This type of creative speech that redefines realities is important because it is one of the ways that we are called to reflect and to partner with God in the world. I want to end this morning by trying to redeem a scary word for you. Speaking of words and right speaking. So here's the scary word. Postmodernism. This is a scary word, right? Especially in the church. The church is really afraid of the thing that we call the postmodern or postmodernism. Right? Have you heard of this word before? One of postmodernism's central tasks in the late 20th century was offering a way for people to actually re-engage and take responsibility for their own words. And what I mean by that is that one of the key insights as people who were postmodern looked at history and culture and theology was that it realized that the realities around us, the realities and worlds around people, don't just exist without any regard for that person's situation. Instead, postmodernism argued that the worlds that shape you and me are deeply affected by the words and the stories that speak into our lives. That what characterizes the postmodern condition is not a rejection of grand stories, one philosopher says, but rather an unveiling of the fact that all of our knowledge of who you are, who I am, who we are as a community, comes through stories. And so be careful, postmodernism says, of the stories that you tell yourself, of the words that speak into your life, and the words that you speak into the lives of others. Because in doing that, you are able to shape whole worlds of being. Perhaps this is one of the more reasons why our gospel text comes from Mark. Jesus asks each of his disciples, and perhaps asks you and me this morning, who do you say that I am? What does your tongue give life to? I think it's interesting that Jesus' question to us and to his disciples comes after he acknowledges what other tongues are doing. He asks his disciples, who do people say that I am? How are those around you trying to speak a certain existence into being? How are those around you trying to shape your perception of God and the world around you by the stories that they are telling? The stakes are really high for Jesus, because caught in the balance is nothing less but God's relationship to humanity. We have been given a great power, church. Words to the end or the beginning of a new world. And so we are called to devote our tongues and speech to God, to proclaim, to say that death doesn't get the last word, but light does. That darkness doesn't get the last word, but light does. And that sin no longer gets the last word, but love gets the last word over our lives and over the life of the world. And so as we're about to sing together, this is my story. This is my song. Thanks be to God. Amen.